Welcome back to my channel. This is the second episode of this Redux course. In the first episode of this course we saw the architecture of Redux. We saw the fundamental of this library. We also saw what is state management, what is the state in a web application. And we also introduced create_store, which is a method from Redux. Now, in this lesson, we will take a look at Redux in practice. We will create a small application for illustrating how to use Redux. We will also see create store, dispatch, and subscribe. Now, a note on Redux. If you've been following the development of Redux, you should know that there is this Redux toolkit, which is a wrapper around Redux, and it is useful for configuring the store without so much hassle. It also has create reducer, create action, create slice, and so on, which are methods for simplifying the operation with Redux. In this course, we will see the building blocks of Redux. I won't use Redux toolkit in these first lessons because I want to show you how to use subscribe, create store, and dispatch in the most simple way. We will use Redux from this website, unpackg, and what I'm going to do is to pick the ES module version of Redux, so we won't need a build system in place to work with import and export. After this introduction, let's go to the code. So I am in this editor, and I'm going to create a new HTML file. This file will hold a simple application, really basic. We can create a new div. Let me enlarge this HTML, and let's create a button. We'll register an event listener on this button, and we'll wire up this button with Redux. Let me give this button an ID too, my button. And also we can create another div here with an ID my div, and as for the style, I'm going to give this display none, so this div will be invisible the first time we visit the page. Also, let me create another Redux working, because with Redux we will display this div later. So we've got this button, we got this div. Now let's add a script here, and what I'm going to do here, I'm going to use a module. It is just for avoiding a build step, so a module is convenient. Let me create a JavaScript file, index, and we hold our Redux code, and now it's src index.js. Now with this script type module, we can write import and export here in this file. Now, to keep things simple, I'm going to import Redux from unpackg, and specifically I'm going to use the ES module version. So it is unpackg Redux. I think I've got already the URL here. Here it is. So we can copy, paste that inside our file, and here I'm going to import create store, that, if you remember, is the Redux function for creating our store. If you recall, the store in Redux is like a brain. It is in charge for moving all the parts of Redux, so we can create a store out of this function, and the store will take a root reducer. Now, in this example, we will keep things simple. I'm going to use a single reducer. Now, what is a reducer in Redux? Now, in the previous episode, we saw that the store is what makes all the moving parts of Redux work together. The reducer, instead, is a function that creates the state. So whether it is the next state or the initial state of the application, this state of the application comes from the root reducer that must be passed inside the create store. Now let's create an initial state. As a convention, you can call the initial state, and this state in Redux is an object. Now, if we take a look at our simple interface, we can see that we have a button and this div. What can we say here is that we can have a button clicked property that it is no for now, and div visible, let's say div visible no. So we will change this state to make the button click to yes and div visible to yes too. Good. Now the reducer is a function that takes the state, and in this case we'll pass the initial state, and takes the action too. Don't look at this button clicked string, the visible string. This help comes from the id. First thing first, the reducer must return the initial state unaltered if there are no state changes. So this is the first rule, the first principle of a Redux reducer. Now, depending on what we want to do inside our interface, we will need to define actions and state changes for these actions. What I mean is that, for example, if we want to change this property to yes, this button click to yes, and this div visible to yes too, we will code two conditions here. How do you create these conditions is up to you. I prefer to use the if, but a lot of developers prefer the switch. So what we're going to do here is to check the action type. So this is really important, and we'll see in a moment what it means, this action type. We will check the action type, and depending of the action type, we'll change the state accordingly. So we will handle this condition with a couple of cases. Now that we created the store, we will have two Redux methods, store.dispatch and store.subscribe. Now, if you remember for the previous episode, whenever we want to change the state in a Redux application, we need to dispatch an action. You can think of the action as of a message that is dispatched inside the application. Let's look again at our interface. It has a button. So we can say that when we click the button, we want to dispatch maybe a couple of actions. So let's select the button in the page, document.getElementById, my button, and then we'll register an event listener for this button, add event listener. Click. Inside this click, we will give a callback, and now what do we want to do? Whenever we click this button, we want to dispatch an action. What is an action in Redux? An action is a JavaScript object. That means that our button... Now, this is just a placeholder for now. In the next episode, we'll see action creator and action constant. For now, keep in mind that the action is a simple JavaScript object with a property which is named type, and this type property is necessary for Redux, otherwise it will error out. Now this action could be button clicked. Okay, now when we click this button, we want to change this initial state to button clicked yes and div visible yes. That means that we can dispatch a couple messages depending on what we need to do. Let's dispatch two messages: const div visible type div visible. Now what I want to do is that when I click this button, I want to change this button clicked in the initial state and div visible to yes. When the div visible property changed to yes, we want to display that div in the page. For now, we've got store.dispatch, and we can dispatch this first action with button clicked action. Let's also dispatch the div visible action with this object. So dispatching an action in Redux means creating a JavaScript object with this property named type, which has this string as a value. And in the next episode we will see why it is important to create named constants for these actions, and we will also see the concept of action creators. The Redux relevant code is this. So we've got two actions and we've got two dispatch for these two actions. So dispatching an action in Redux again means sending a message to the store. The store will react to this state change depending how we wire up these conditions here. The other method that we need to talk about is subscribe. Subscribe is really important in Redux, and it is used for listening to state changes. That means you can think of subscribe as of an add element listener. In fact, it takes a callback. I'm using a regular function here for clarity. Now, whenever a new action is dispatched, we want to listen for that change so we can update the UI accordingly. That means that whenever I dispatch an action, this subscribe will fire up. Now, if you think about it, if you already worked with Redux in a React application, you can see why it is important to use an abstraction over subscribe, because subscribe is run anytime there is a new state change in Redux. That means that in a React application or any other front-end application, this subscribe function will run anytime there is a state change. If you're not careful, your front-end will render anytime there is a state changes. For now, we're good because this is just an introduction. So anytime there is a state change, we do something. That means that, at least for this example, we can check that the action that we're interested in is, for example, the visible, because in this store.subscribe, I want just to change the visibility of this div here, and we will change the style to display block, so this piece of interface will be visible on the page. And there is this other method of the store, getState. Now, with getState, you can access any property that is available inside the state. That means that I can check div visible. If div visible equal yes, then react to these state changes. Let's select the div here, const div, document that get element by id. It is my div, if I can recall. Let's change the style of this div. Okay, so we've got dispatch from the store, which is used to send a new message to the store. Then we've got subscribe, that is a function that is listening for state changes. It is passed a callback. In this callback, we check that the property that we're interested to is indeed has indeed changed. So when this property is modified and becomes yes, we can display that block. Now, we've got all the building blocks of Redux. We've got the store, we created the store, we create store, which takes a reducer. For now we're good. We have this create store, we have the reducer, and we saw dispatch and subscribe. As a last step, we need to code the reducer so it can understand actions. Since we are in a switch now, let's use the default branch. So switch action type default return the state, and this is important. If there is no action type matching what we want to change in the state, then we must return the initial state unaltered. If instead we want to change the state, we can check that. For example, if button clicked, if action type is button clicked, we check the action type. So we've got this string repeated here, and later we will see why it is important to abstract away those strings. If we have this button clicked, then we can return the next state. Okay, in a moment we will wire up this state change. Let's add another case here, case div visible. Okay, and here we will also return another piece of state. Now, important thing to keep in mind. You might be tempted to do state dot button clicked equal yes. So this is a direct mutation of the initial state, and in Redux it is not impossible to mutate the state in this way, but this is not best practice, it is bad practice, and it breaks the immutability principle in Redux. What we need to do instead is return another object with object.assign, which takes an empty object as the first argument. Then here we can pass the state, so you can imagine this state being merged inside the first empty object. And here we will pass another object with the modification that we want to make. Here we need to do the same thing, so object.assign empty object, state, and another object with the property divisible yes. So we wired up the reducer, so anytime there is a dispatch of type button click or divisible, this is a button clicked action, divisible action, just for keeping things consistent. So anytime there is one of these action dispatch, the reducer receives the action, checks the action type, and depending of the action type, we decide how to change the state. It is more correct how to say how to return the next state, because in reality we don't change the initial state. Now there is an alternate syntax for this object.assign, and it is the spread syntax, where we return a new empty object with the initial state spread inside this object and with the property that we want to change. This is a personal preference. I like this object spread syntax. Object assign sometimes could be too overwhelming for beginners. Anyway, feel free to use whichever syntax you prefer. They are interchangeable. Only thing you must be aware of is that obviously this object spread is new JavaScript syntax and won't work in older browsers. Okay, enough talking. Let's see if everything is in place. We have create store, initial state. We wired up the reducer, so anytime it receives a new action dispatch, it checks the type and changes the interface. We created the store, and here we dispatch the two actions, and anytime there is a new state change, Redux launches this subscribe, and we decided to check with getState if divisible and will be yes, and in that case we will show that piece of interface to the user. So to recap before launching the application, the three most important methods of Redux are dispatch for dispatching action, subscribe for listening to state changes, and getState for checking the state. If you work with React and Redux before, you can already see that these methods are abstracted away by React Redux, which is the official binding for React, but nothing prevents you from using Redux with vanilla JavaScript. Okay, so dispatch, subscribe, and getState. Now let's try this application inside the browser. Now you should have a new version of Node.js to use this npx. It is convenient because with npx serve we can serve these files in localhost, and we can check things out quickly. Let's see if everything is working right in this application. So I open it up with my browser, this simple application. We have this button, click me, and if I click on this button, now I'm expecting to see Redux working, which is the header that we created inside our HTML, and at this moment it is hidden inside our interface with display none. Now, when I click on this button, I've got an event listener here, and this event listener will dispatch two actions: button clicked action and divisible action. When this button is clicked, store.subscribe will react to state changes, and as for we wired up the reducer, the state will change and will become button clicked yes and divisible yes. So when clicking this button, this div will appear inside the page. Let's give it a shot. Click me, and here we go. We have this Redux working in this page. If you take a look at this code, we dispatch the action as we saw in the debugger, and with store.subscribe we check that this divisible has changed to yes, and then we change this display property of the div. And that is Redux in the most simple way. There is an initial state, there is a reducer that it's the most convoluted piece of code in all this big picture, but everything is more or less understandable. We've got this event listener, and we dispatched two actions. Again, store.subscribe can react to state changes. In the next episode, we will see in brief what are action creators, what are named constant. We will complete this first big picture of Redux. Make sure to subscribe to my channel to get notified when new episodes are out. Thanks for watching, and see you later.